We have three eminent scholars with us for this session titled Milestones in Oklahoma Indigenous History, from the Civil War in Indian Territory to the state of Sequoia. I know I'm starting a little early, but I want to make sure our speakers have enough time to really get into their work and to share it with all of us. At the same time, I want to make a comment about the program. How wonderful is it this afternoon that we have all of these fascinating sessions competing with one another. We're seeing all of these people all around. So let's give our program team a hand, a round of applause. This is absolutely wonderful. So this session explores various milestones in Oklahoma Indigenous histories. And as we look at our program, I would just like to let you know we're going to go in the following order. We'll begin with Michelle Martin, followed by Natalie Panther, and conclude with Donald L. Fixico. But I'd like to offer the following introductions. Michelle M. Martin is a historian, educator, and public history advocate with over 2 decades of experience in academia, museums, and historic preservation. Originally from Michigan, Dr. Martin holds a BA and MA in history from Western Michigan University and the PhD from the University of New Mexico in 2022. Martin's research examined interracial marriage, gender, race, and power in the Muskogee Nation in Indian Territory from 1870 to 1897. With teaching positions at Mesa Community College and Arizona State University, Dr. Martin also contributes to film and television projects as a researcher, scriptwriter, and field producer for PBS, A&E, and the History Channel. Our second presenter will be Dr. Natalie Panther, Associate Professor of History and my colleague at the University of Central Oklahoma. And I should also say I'm a proud board member of the Oklahoma Historical Society and Dr. Panther's colleague in history at the University of Central Oklahoma. Dr. Panther is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and her family is from the Osalada, Ramona area in the Cherokee Nation Reservation. Dr. Panther was born and raised in Bixby, Oklahoma, within the Muskogee Nation Reservation. Before coming to the University of Central Oklahoma, Dr. Panther served as the assistant director of the Helmerich Center for American Research at Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa from 2014 to 2019. Dr. Panther received her PhD in American History from Oklahoma State University in 2013 and received the BA from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. Panther's research and scholarly interests include the history of Native American education and tribal sovereignty. Panther lives in Tulsa with her cat, and this is the best part, Dr. Meow Meow Fluffy Pants. And our third speaker for this incredible session is Dr. Donald L. Fixico, Muskogee, Seminole, Shawnee, and Sac and Fox, and born in Oklahoma. Dr. Fixico is Regents and Distinguished Foundation Professor at Arizona State University. Earlier this year in March, Don was inducted in the Oklahoma Historians Hall of Fame. Let's give it up for Dr. Fixico. So this honor to be inducted into the Oklahoma Historians Hall of Fame, Dr. Fixico is following in the footsteps of Angie DeBow, Muriel Wright, and Don's advisor, Errol Gibson. Fixico has published over 20 books during his illustrious career, and recent books include The Light Horse Police, A History of Tribal Justice, which came out in 2026, or coming out in 2026. Cheeto Harjo, Native Participation and the Medicine Way, 2025, and a finalist for the Oklahoma Historical Society Book Award this year. The state of Sequoia, Indigenous Sovereignty and the Quest for an Indian State, which came out 2024. So when I think that I'm being productive, I'm not being as productive as Dr. Fixico. I have more work to do, but we've got an incredible program. So let's begin with Dr. Martin.
Good afternoon. It is so lovely to see you all here today. And today I want to share with you all the sorrows of the world, Hannah Wooster Hicks and the Civil War in the Cherokee Nation. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, an abbreviated journey. Our roadmap and guide for this look at how the Civil War in Indian Territory impacted civilians is a very small diary that covers less than 1 year of a woman's life and a handful of letters written during the Civil War and then in some decades after. And we are able to piece together a picture of what life was like for men, women, and children who were non-combatants during this time of terrible conflict, loss, and suffering. Hannah Wooster is, of course, the daughter of Samuel Austin Wooster of the famed Wooster v. Georgia case. And so she was born in the Southeast in the Cherokee homeland, and her family had lived among the Cherokee people. And when the Cherokee were forcibly removed from their homelands and forced on the Trail of Tears, the Wooster family came along with and wanted to continue ministering to and helping to create systems of education for Cherokee people. And of course, Hannah, her brother, her sisters all came along on that very difficult journey. So on April 8th, 1835, their family left the Brainerd Mission in Tennessee and made their way to the Indian Territory. Here, Hannah and her siblings attended the Park Hill Mission, and they were learning alongside Cherokee students with whom they formed close relationships. One young Cherokee man, young gentleman at Park Hill, Abijah Hicks, became a surrogate son to Samuel Austin Wooster when his own sons and elder daughters had left to go back to the United States to further their education. And Abijah formed a very close personal attachment to Hannah, and in January of 1852, the couple were wed. Their family grew, and by the time Hannah's father died in 1859, they had 3 young children. With the opening salvos of the Civil War, the Hicks family had welcomed their 5th child, just as war unleashed its fury upon not only the nation, but the Indian Territory and the Trans-Mississippi West. And the Cherokee, along with their other southeastern brethren, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, found themselves caught between multiple fires. Do you keep ties with the Confederacy? Do you make ties with the Union? Or do you remain neutral? It seemed no matter what choice Native people made here in the Indian Territory, it was difficult. And so Hannah's world is going to go ahead and be turned upside down. But for them, the choice was clear. They strongly, firmly supported the Union. They were active in calling for the abolition of slavery, and they knew very well that this choice would endanger their safety. When I first read Hannah's diary in the summer of 2019, actually, that's how I met Dr. Panther. I was the inaugural short-term research fellow at the Helmrich Center for American Research, and I read this diary hoping to find other people mentioned in it, and they weren't. But you go down those rabbit holes, and then I saw this diary and went, oh my gosh, I have to have a copy of this because there's something here, it's amazing. Her diary covers less than a year of her life, but what it lacks in volume or amount, it more than makes up for in detail because we get a very intimate portrait of the war. For those of you who are historians in the room, you'll love the fact she actually annotated and wrote footnotes for her own diary, which is really interesting. And she actually, it's very sad in a way. The little note section is called Notes for Sister Ann Eliza. Her sister was Ann Eliza Wooster Robertson, who was married to William Schenck Robertson, and they were missionaries at the Tallahassee Mission in the Muskogee Nation. And I really think Hannah did not believe she would live to see the end of the Civil War. And so those notes were there to further clarify things if this diary ever came into the hands of her sister. So, one of the topics that Hannah covers in great detail are murders and extralegal killings. And you'll see here on the right-hand side in the top, you'll see a death notice for Abijah Hicks. It's from a New York newspaper, because one of the first things that she notes is the assassination, and I use that word on purpose, the assassination of her husband. On July 4th, 1862, Abijah left Hannah and their children alone in Park Hill. He set off for Van Buren, Arkansas. He traveled there on a regular basis to procure supplies and merchandise for his mercantile store. Hannah noted in her diary, Van Buren was, quote, festooned with Confederate banners, but there's considerable Union support underneath. And of course, they both believed he would make it home, as he always did. Sadly, this was not to be. On the Sabbath of August 7th, 1862, Hannah wrote, "Oh, what a year to remember this year ever will be to me and to us all. We thought we had some trouble last year, but how happy was that compared with this? But this year, on the 4th of July, my beloved husband was murdered, killed away off from home, and I could not see him. So far from it, he had been buried 24 hours before I even heard of it, buried without a coffin, all alone, 40 miles from home. Alas, alas, my husband, still the cry of my heart every day and every hour is, oh, my husband. My husband left home and I saw him for the last time riding his little wagon past the garden corner on the 30th of June. And her agony just compounds from this point on. On the left, you actually see one of the pages from her diary where she talks about his murder. And on the bottom right here, the newspapers in Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas are filled with notices about what's taking place in the Indian Territory, and in particular in the Cherokee Nation during this time of war. Another thing that she writes about in extensive detail are different kinds of raids and the destruction that they go ahead and experience. In particular, now she's a widow and she has to protect her family. She writes, on the night of, or rather the 31st of July, 1st of August, our house was burnt down. That was the first great trial that my husband was not here to share with me. But truly, I hardly felt it a trial, so very little did it seem compared with what I suffered in losing him in such a terrible way. Oh, for grace to submit in a right spirit to every trial. I believe my heart is almost dead within me. And this would not be the first time that Hannah experienced loss and privation, and she notes in her diary this is happening to pro-Confederate, neutral, and pro-Union Cherokee families, and sometimes it's their very neighbors and individuals they had trusted and fed at their own tables who were doing the raiding against people they knew, and that this was a time for people to raid one another, steal, and really cause a lot of mayhem and terror, and to line their pockets, she felt. In 1862, in December, she said, today we've had the experience of being robbed. As I expected, as soon as it was light, they came, and it begun. They took many valuable things and overhauled every closet, trunk, box, and drawer they could find. The leaders were Cherokees, many who have often eaten in my house and enjoyed my hospitality. So actually here you see Hunter's Home. It is an OHS site. Even Hunter's Home that was belonged to the Merles, who are connected to the Ross family. Even this home did not escape being molested during the war. As you see, Hannah was robbed. The other thing she talks about is hunger and starvation for people. And in particular, I find it really incredible. She actually decides to bundle up her child in December of 1862 because she has heard that Union Commander Colonel William A. Phillips is in the region. She's had it with no support coming for especially the pro-Union Cherokee families and the neutrals, and she gets on a mule with her baby bundled up, her small child bundled up, and it's bitter, awful weather, and she rides to the military camp that's set up outside of Fort Gibson and says, "I'm not leaving until you let me speak to Colonel Phillips." She speaks to Colonel Phillips. Her name, her maiden name carries that power and cachet, and she's able to speak to Phillips, and she exacts a very weak promise of food for the people. And, you know, from that point on, her diary is kind of reads like an insurance list of the things they have lost, the things they are missing, but she also writes a great deal about the starvation and hunger they face. So I wish I could say that Hannah's life got better after the war. During the course of the war, Hannah formed a close attachment to her brother-in-law, Dr. Hitchcock. Hitchcock had been married to her sister Sarah, who had passed away. He was raising their 2 children. Hannah's raising her 5 children. And before the close of the war, the 2 decide to marry. They figure it makes good sense. They're of like mind, they're compatible. They now can keep the families together, and things actually improve for Hannah. But in 1867, after the close of the war, with so many people malnourished with sickness, hunger, and privation, a cholera outbreak swept through the area around Fort Gibson, Tahlequah. And sadly, as Dr. Hitchcock is ministering to those who need his help, he contracts the disease and succumbs to it himself. Now Hannah is a widow with 7 children to raise instead of 5. So she will die in 1917, having never married again. And you can see here, this is her final resting place in the Officers' Ring of Honor at Fort Gibson National Cemetery. You can actually visit that for yourself. And on the top there is a photograph of Hannah along with her other Wooster siblings. And as you can see, they all lived into old age.
Hello. Hello. Hi. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, nice. My name is Natalie Panther. Like Dr. Loughlin said, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And today I'll be talking about the history of mental health treatment in Indian Territory and early statehood. So I've been thinking about this topic for a while, and when Dr. Martin asked me to be on this panel and said the theme is Milestones in Oklahoma History, I knew that I wanted to talk about the history of mental health treatment in Indian Territory, because if we're talking about milestones in mental health care, the Cherokee Nation built the first residential facility called an asylum for Native Americans with mental illnesses in the United States. So this is a significant milestone in Oklahoma history. Okay, so the Cherokee Nation, it was called the home for the, quote, insane, deaf, dumb, and blind. It opened in 1876. This is the Cherokee Nation providing institutional care to Cherokees struggling with mental illnesses. But before I talk about the Cherokee, the psychiatric hospital, we need to understand the importance of traditional mental health practices among the Cherokee. And how do I do this? The right arrow. The right arrow? Nice. Okay, so when we're looking at traditional methods of treating mental illness, there are traditional Cherokee healers. They're also called Adoniski. That means a local healer or a medicine keeper. And they're using a holistic approach to mental health treatment. And they're thinking of individual and community health in terms of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So they're approaching illness holistically. Physical and psychological illnesses are not seen as mutually exclusive. Each town has its own adaniski, and in order to become an adaniski, you would have a long-term apprenticeship until you could prove your competence over a long period of time. And once you were an adaniski, you would not charge for your services. This was just part of your kinship obligations. But you would receive generous gifts like baskets or jewelry or horses, sometimes food. And the idea was to restore balance in the individual, just like you would use ceremonies to restore balance in a community. So major ceremonies are meant to protect the health and well-being of each community. And so this same treatment is applied to individuals. Okay, so I wanted to briefly talk about some terms that you're going to hear. The 19th century, early 20th century had different terms for mental illnesses than we have today. The term asylum means a fully segregated facility set apart from mainstream society. The term insane is a 19th and 20th century term to designate mental illness. The term, quote, dumb was a 19th and early 20th century term for someone unable to speak. Okay, so the Cherokee Nation, home for the insane, deaf, dumb, and blind. It was passed in 1872. It opened in 1876 and closed in 1908. It was located in Park Hill, which is about 6 miles outside Tahlequah. The goal is to restore individuals with a mental illness to their communities, to rehabilitate people so that they can rejoin their communities. So after the Civil War, like Dr. Martin was talking about, the Cherokee Nation had to quickly adapt and respond to new realities in this post-removal, post-Civil War life. In 1872, the Cherokee National Council were creating institutions to serve those Cherokees who needed assistance. So they designated different groups of protected peoples, including orphans, people with disabilities, and people with a mental illness. They were thinking we need to create national institutions that will serve these Cherokees. So they dedicated $100,000 from the sale of the Cherokee Strip in Kansas to a home for the insane, deaf, dumb, and blind, and indigent. As historian Julie Reed writes in her book, Serving the Nation, she writes, quote, faced with removal and civil war, rather than turn its social services over to non-Indians, the Cherokee Nation asserted its right to build institutions within the nation, administered by the Cherokee Nation, both as an affirmation of its national sovereignty and as a community imperative, end quote. So after the Civil War, the Cherokee Medical Board was created and adopted rules addressing public health and medical needs arising from the war. And so they created this position of the medical superintendent who oversaw the asylum and the Cherokee male and female seminaries and the national prison. And the first person to serve in this position was Walter Thompson Adair. He was one of the first Cherokee physicians trained in medical school. He returned to the Cherokee Nation and served in this leadership position. Okay, I'm already out of time. Okay. So the asylum was 6 miles from Tahlequah. It was 40 feet by 148-foot brick asylum building completed in 1876. It opened the following year with 22 patients, 14 male and 8 female. So the Cherokee Nation is using a combination of care, rehab, and education that reflected both U.S. practices and a traditional understanding of medicine, illness, and kinship. Okay, so one of the things they were trying to avoid was hiring non-native doctors to serve or to work in the nation. The Cherokee Nation is encouraging Cherokees to go to medical school and return to work in the nation. Many wanted to avoid inviting non-natives into the nation because white doctors might and did exploit indigenous communities who were in need of medical care for profit. Another problem with the presence of white doctors was racist attitudes within the medical profession. In an 1844 issue of the Journal of Insanity, which is the precursor to the Journal of Psychiatry, a scholar concluded that Cherokees and Africans were incapable of suffering from insanity. So this is basically Americans in the United States not wanting to take responsibility for any mental health outcomes from settler colonial policies. So the Cherokee Nation they're taking measures to reduce the chances of non-Indians moving into the nation for profit. They passed legislation that stipulated that physicians who were not citizens of the Cherokee Nation, they had to appear before the Cherokee Board of Medicine to get permission. If they did not appear, they were considered intruders and they would be kicked out, they would be expelled. There was a licensing fee for non-Indians to practice medicine in the Cherokee Nation. If you were Cherokee or an intermarried white, you did not have to pay this fee. Okay. To be admitted to the asylum, a person had to have cause, they had to be destitute, and they had to have no relatives able to take care of them. Okay. I'm so sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, so originally the asylum was trying to incorporate a kinship ethic and trying to work with communities to take care of patients in the hospital, but over time it became more like other insane asylums in the United States. They ordered a couple of metal cages. They ordered 6 straitjackets. They ordered an electric apparatus because electrocution, electroshock therapy was common back then. It was so common that in the U.S. House of Representatives, they had an electroshock machine down in the basement, and congressmen would go down there and after a long talk, but they would go down there and like shock themselves to get more energy. Right. Okay, so after the asylum closed, so changes after statehood. With the passage of the Curtis Act in 1898, with the passage of the Curtis Act in 1898, the asylum eventually closed, and then the Norman Asylum in Oklahoma opened, the Eastern State Hospital in Veneta opened, and then the Canton Asylum for Insane Indians also opened. And so patients who were at the Cherokee Asylum were kind of dispersed to these main institutions. And so today we're looking at returning to using traditional treatment methods for people with a mental illness, and incorporating those back into how we are treating Native Americans today. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to give you a presentation today that you will never forget. And that is because I wrote a book on the state of Sequoia. And so a couple of years ago, I gave a book talk, about 3 or 4 book talks about the state of Sequoia. And one of those book talks, I wrote it in a blue notebook, so I was all prepared for it and everything. We've been so busy at Arizona State University, I helped organize a lecture on Thursday, making sure that everything went well. And I thought, well, I'm going to use the notes from my book talk in that blue notebook. I brought the wrong blue notebook. So I'm going to do a fast kind of presentation of the slides up here. And it's about the State of Sequoia movement, and it's more about a movement rather than the state itself. So imagine that back after the Civil War and in the following years, that we could be very well be sitting in a place called the State of Sequoia. But it went by many names at the time: Neosho, Lincoln, Osceola, Seminole. And so these names were vied for. In fact, the capital of the Indian Territory that was going to become the State of Sequoia was going to be at Fort Gibson. It was going to be there for 6 years. And so in the process, there's a deep argument over these possibilities of names. But after the Civil War, keep in mind that there was so much energy going on. Energy going on, and as this country tried to rebuild itself, at the same time we have westward expansion and manifest destiny, the call of manifest destiny. Throughout the entire West, different territories were becoming states. But nothing happens without leadership. And so it's the leadership of Charles Curtis, not so much in the movement, but I'll get to him a little bit later, but Charles Haskell and William Murray. And so these individuals were very much a part of the statehood movement, but for the Native people, it was Pleasant Porter. So Pleasant Porter was one of the driving forces. So these individuals, it was a time in the late 1800s of dynamic power and energy and individuals like that. But all throughout the entire West, change was coming about, whether you liked it or not. So as this possibility comes, then we have this kind of movement of national completeness. So when you look at the new states after 1888, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, etc., keep in mind that these were territories first. So settlements coming together, becoming territories, and then the territories becoming states. This is the context. It was an energy of national completeness and statehood movements going throughout. And so the Indian Territory was caught up in this. But keep in mind, too, it was the creation of the twin territories after the Civil War, and the eastern half of the original Indian Territory was going to become a state. And so when you look at this time period, then it's one of energy and completeness and statehood movements going on. So the state of Sequoia was caught up in this kind of energy and everything going on at the same time. And so this was what was happening throughout the entire country, for that matter, throughout the entire world. So westward expansion equaling new statehood, and sometimes we forget about this, but there were also a movement for an African-American state. A part of Indian Territory was going to become the state of Lincoln. And in addition to that, the lower fourth of Texas almost became a state of Lincoln. So Lincoln was a very popular word, and also Jefferson, for these possible states. North Dakota wasn't going to become North Dakota. It almost became the state of Lincoln. A part of Alaska also became almost a separate state. As you know, there's a possibility even today of some state, if it has to agree that part of its territory or area can become a state, and by legislation, there could still be a state of Sequoia. So imagine this, that this flag right here, state of Oklahoma, could very well be the state of Sequoia. Thank you.
a microphone too? Okay. That was wonderful, and I'm so pleased to say we have time for questions. So what questions do you have for our presenters? Yes.
Were there other sources of information about Hannah besides the Gilcrease Center and TU?
So the question was, are there other sources of information about Hannah Wooster Hicks Hitchcock besides those that are at HCAR and at TU? Obviously, if you go out, you can find federal census records. You find her discussed in some of the Indian Territory, the Indian Pioneer Paper interviews. You're going to find there are letters that she wrote to her sister. Other family members, Hannah's children wrote different pieces about their mother, and of course, newspaper articles.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious, is Panther?
And a microphone is making its way to you.
As you were talking about mental health care with Indigenous people, I was thinking back on the series Reservation Dogs that Sterling or Harjo. Did you see that? And was the hospital that was depicted in that series accurate in your view? It was he doesn't say what tribe did that, but it was
Was it the Indian clinic? That episode?
Well, one of the
Yeah.
kids gets a job at a hospital, and it's a
I don't remember
Indigenous
that
hospital.
episode.
Indian clinic.
I don't remember. I'm sorry. I do not remember that episode.
It looked like a typical state hospital, but it might have been.
Well, I don't know about that, but the IHS hospital in Claremore was kind of the typical government-run hospital. There is a newer hospital in Tulsa. It's the Muskogee. Council Oak Health. Yeah, Council Oak Health, and it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful new state-of-the-art building with just wonderful facilities and doctors. Have you been there?
It's the former Cancer Treatment Center of America.
Yes, right.
It's wonderful. It's gorgeous.
I think I kind of remember that episode of the IHS hospital.
There's a clinic and then there's a hospital.
Right. Anyway, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Let's wait. Okay, let's wait for the microphone to. Here's the microphone.
Okay. I'm retired from there, and I was actually a commissioned officer, but I am also Cherokee. But anyway, the television show was spot on. And that facility really looked like you could have been in my office or something. And so it was, it was probably, I don't have any idea where they filmed it, but it looked like that. Yeah.
We've got questions over here and over here. And up front.
And the nice thing is we have some time. We have time for questions.
Thank you all so much for your presentations to us today. I am learning so much, and I'm excited for the rest of the afternoon as well. Dr. Panther, I was wondering when you were talking initially about the mental health clinic that was set up, you said that the goal was reintegration into the community, and then later you talked about sort of bringing in these metal cages and electroshock therapy and some of these things. What happened to sort of shift that, or did they think those things were the means by which they were going to achieve reintegration? Can you talk a little bit more about that process for us, please?
Yeah, so the patient population swelled very quickly. And so from what I read, the cages might have been for safety reasons, but also might have been for economic, financial reasons, because over time they were understaffed. When they're getting closer to statehood, the nation is spending so much money on delegations in DC. They needed to have a full-time delegation in DC to prevent allotment bills from passing. Every year there were 4 to 5 allotment bills that were introduced, and so you had this Cherokee delegation that they were there year-round to try to stop these bills from being passed. And so much money was going into that, they had less funding for the asylum and the orphan asylum and the schools and things like that.
Thank you, Ahiahet, for all what you said. Folks there know me. I'm Farina King. I'm at OU. I teach Native American studies there, and what all your presentations really made me think about, and also I heard the Q&A of the last session in this room that also got at intersections of African American and Native American histories. And what that conversation brought up was a lot of the debates and contestations over narratives, what we teach, what we learn. And just recently, I was in a conversation with students. This is all relating to a question that I want to ask all three of you. I was in a classroom with students primarily who all went to school in Oklahoma. I did not go to school in Oklahoma, K through 12. And we were talking about the McGirt case. I know there's another session with Robert Miller that will be about that. And so we were reflecting on the recent State of Union address, if that's the official title of the governor, Stitt, earlier this year. And also what was the dives into history with that case and the impacts and such. And students, the question comes up, were there reservations, Indian reservations in what is now Oklahoma? And many of the students in the class were still very confused about that case, not able to answer that question of were there reservations here, like Cherokee as a reservation? And I was pretty shocked by that because almost all of them went to school here in this state, and I had a class with graduate students and undergraduate students, some who were about to graduate, some who had studied political science. Most of them were Native American themselves. And so it just really hit me in the gut because one of them said, well, I didn't learn this at all in school. And I even chuckled because I didn't believe it. It was almost like unbelievable. And so I feel like everything that you're sharing isn't taught in the schools, and a lot of it gets at this ongoing tension over sovereignty. And there is, what it means to be a state, what it means to be Native nations, tribal sovereignty, and also federal relationships and all these things. And, I can get into very particular questions for each of you, but I wonder, what are your thoughts about how your research, the work that you're doing, how it can reach not only a general public like adults here, but how it matters in introducing this to our youth? I have 3 children who now have gone through the public school, they're in the public schools here in Oklahoma, first in Tahlequah and now in Norman. Mm-hmm. And this is, I then talked to my own kids after that conversation with my students. They're taking Oklahoma history, and they aren't talking about this kind of important stuff and why it matters, why to articulate that. So that's what I did want to bring up, because it can be complicated. Do we have to be lawyers to understand this? No, I don't think so. Not by the way the 3 of you present and the important work you do. Yeah, wado mado.
Okay, so I think a key to the conversations and a key to understanding McGirt, are the treaties of 1866. The treaties of 1866 were signed with the 5 tribes, but the Choctaws and the Chickasaws signed one of those treaties together. So when you look at those treaties of 1866, they sit and they establish the boundaries of the 5 nations, and the boundaries, according to McGirt, are still recognized. So go to Charles Kepler, go online, look up the treaties of 1866 and see exactly what they say. And they say that the boundaries of all the 5 nations are there, set, and they've been challenged, but they're still intact, and that's the key to McGirt.
I think we have time for one more question, and so we'll go to the center of the room, and then we will listen to this question and the responses from our 3, right up there with the, yeah.
Hello, I'm Wendell Long, and I question the comment about doctors going down for electroshock therapy as, I guess, pleasurable because electroshock therapy erases all recent memory. Did they really do this? I can't believe it.
Yes, there are documents in the National Archives that talk about congressmen going to the basement after having like an extremely long speech, or maybe a, what do you call it when you're, filibuster. Maybe after that to kind of, as a way to like rejuvenate your energy. That's, yes.
And we will have time to continue some of these individual conversations. We're at time, so please join me in thanking our 3 esteemed panelists.